Today on Things You Should Know, we're discussing the new approved FDA and CDC vaccine from Johnson & Johnson, so stick around. Here at Things You Should Know podcast, our focus varies from commonly asked questions like, what are the top email apps for iPhone users, or how much does it cost to go to Disney World anyway? To the trending topics of the day, such as, are taxes going up or down? And who's Elon Musk? We shed light on things you probably have always wondered about, but you never got around to investigating them yourself. This podcast brings you the answers to your most commonly asked questions and makes you smarter just by listening. Information empowers, and the more information you have, the better decision you can make, and ultimately, your quality of life is based on the decisions you make. So, thanks for joining the discussion, and make sure that you subscribe today and not miss out on any future episodes of Things You Should Know. Hey guys, welcome to the show, Things You Should Know. I am your host, Kelly, and today's February the 28th, and a great time to be listening to Things You Should Know. Today's podcast, we're going to cover briefly but thoroughly the new Johnson & Johnson approval for the COVID-19 vaccine. So we have 3 on the market now. And if you've been listening to this podcast for any time, we've already done a podcast and described to you the single shot dosage that was being proposed by Johnson & Johnson. And also all of the vaccines, for that matter, we've kind of gone through, and we've got one more hanging out there that I expect to be going for EUA approval pretty soon, and that is AstraZeneca. We won't get into that today. We're going to talk about the Johnson & Johnson approval, what that means, and how it compares. So if this is your first time to the podcast, please make sure that you are subscribing so that the next time a podcast comes out, which should be 48 hours from now, we put out a podcast every other day, you'll be the first to know and to be able to listen. Thank you guys that are continuing to support the podcast for coming back and listening each and every week. Please make sure you check out our Facebook page, like us there, and subscribe. There are going to be a lot of good articles and information posted on a weekly basis to keep you informed and therefore empowered. So let's get going. Johnson & Johnson. So the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, on Saturday, which was yesterday, approved the single-shot COVID-19 vaccine as an EUA, or an emergency use authority, for this particular vaccine. Now, again, if you search back through our podcast, we did a podcast before. We talked about in detail what the vaccine was, and we thought it would go pretty quickly through the process, and it did. It's been less than 30 days since they submitted and were approved through the FDA and the CDC. Now we have 3 vaccines to fight this pandemic, so that's good news as well. One of the concerns is that many people in the public are reading into the numbers as it relates to efficacy rates, and the concern now is that many people won't want the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because they don't necessarily understand how the efficacy rates are distributed and communicated. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So the Johnson & Johnson company has pledged to provide the U.S. 100 million doses by the end of June. Combined with the 600 million doses from the 2 other shot vaccines, that's Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna, those are slated to arrive by the end of July. So there will be more than enough shots to cover any American adult who wants one. So that's good news. Federal and state health officials are concerned that even though strong data supports it, some people may perceive that the J&J shot is an inferior shot. The new vaccine's 72% efficacy rate in the U.S. clinical trial site, a number of scientists have celebrated, it falls short of the roughly 95% rate found in the studies tested by Moderna and Pfizer. Across the trials, The Johnson & Johnson vaccine also showed 85% efficacy rates against severe forms of COVID-19 and 100% efficacy rates against hospitalization and death. Quote, don't get caught up necessarily on the numbers game because it's really a good vaccine. And what we need is as many good vaccines as possible. This comes from Dr. Fauci, the government's top infectious disease expert, who said in an interview on Saturday, and this article is brought to us by the New York Times. I'm going to sort to you, give you the sources where we receive this information. So this first bit of information comes from the New York Times. Dr. Fauci goes on to say, rather than parsing the difference between 94 and 72, accept the fact that now you have 3 highly effective vaccines, period, which is, end quote, which I think is the essence of this. Stop focusing on the fact that the numbers look different. I'm going to explain to you why they look different, but be more concerned about the availability of vaccines, because a year ago, well, we were just entering this, but a few months ago, we were really concerned about when we were going to get a vaccine, and the death totals were just mounting up and mounting up. And now people are concerning themselves with things that, quite honestly, seem to be a little sidebars. Let's be thankful that we do have these vaccines to fight this disease that have taken so many around the world. So if Johnson & Johnson's vaccine would have been the first to be authorized in the United States instead of the third, quote, everybody would be doing handstands and backflips and high fives. This comes from Dr. James McDevitt. He's Dean of Clinical Affairs at Baylor College of Medicine, and I agree with him. All right, from CNN, this is really good news. Dr. Esther Cho, a professor of emergency medicine at Oregon Health and Science University. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine performs very well, still has an outstanding safety profile, and then has the added benefit of tremendous convenience. Remember, Johnson & Johnson doesn't require 2 shots. Johnson & Johnson doesn't require this deep freeze, transport, storage component like Pfizer. Think about it more than just the United States. Think about third world countries where now 1 shot and you can be vaccinated and you can begin to slow down and further stop the spread of COVID, even at a marginal lower percentage rate than some like Pfizer and Moderna. You still got to think, if people are getting 2 shots, are you coming back to get that second shot? I'm going to show you what those numbers look like in a few minutes, because if you recall the earlier podcast I did, I was a little concerned about people following up and getting that second shot. Excuse me. FDA analysts found that the vaccine is safe and effective. It can be kept in similar refrigerated temperatures. Unlike the 2 COVID-19 vaccines that already are authorized in the U.S., Johnson & Johnson's vaccine only requires 1 dose. And I think that really is the most important piece of this. That's a big deal, according to Dr. Cho. Quote, it's been such a challenge to get even a single dose to many people, Cho indicated, which of course we know. Quote, signing up for a second one, keeping track of that, getting transportation is just a huge barrier for many Americans. And then, of course, it's harder to reach places, including rural America. It's just been a huge logistical challenge, end quote. So you have to think about rural counties, smaller networks in terms of these doctors' offices and things like that. And every area doesn't have this sort of accessibility like Manhattan or Chicago or Los Angeles or Atlanta or Dallas or Houston. You got to be thinking about rural South Dakota and Wisconsin and different places where there are a large quantity of people, but there are smaller medical networks. And in addition to that, think about other people in other places within the world. Quote, to have a third vaccine that meets the expectation of an EUA, an emergency use authorization for safety and effectiveness at preventing severe disease and death from COVID-19, brings us 1 step closer to protecting the American public, staying ahead of concerning viral variants, and finding our way out of the pandemic. This from Dr. Francis Collins of the National Institute of Health. So far, more than 48.4 million Americans have received at least their first dose of COVID-19 vaccine. This is according to CDC. Now, more than 23.6 million people have gotten both doses. So 48 million have one, 23 have the other. That's less than half have followed up. Now, some still have appointments, I'm assuming. Unfortunately, that's only 7.1% of the U.S. population. That's only 7.1% of the U.S. population. Now, quote, the J&J vaccine, which is easier to transport and store, is going to dramatically increase vaccine availability. This according to Dr. Jonathan Rayner. He's a professor of medicine at George Washington University. Again, quote, this is a big deal. It's a big deal, end quote. About 3.9 million doses will be available for ordering right away. I read before where Johnson & Johnson had promised upon approval they'd have 100 million doses, like I read earlier, for the American public, and they will have that. But immediately they only have the 3.9 on hand. So they are ramping up. They're going to have this 100 million by the end of June. Having done this, according to Lori Freeman, CEO of National Association of County and City Health Officials, this could add about 25% more COVID-19 vaccine capacity for the states. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, told CNN that he expects the state will receive, quote, several thousand doses over the next few days, and we expect shots in arms this coming week. We know that we have 4 million doses on hand right now, ready to go. They'll start shipping those out. We have on Monday. We believe on Monday. We should have those shots, we think, on Wednesday and shots in the arms by Thursday and Friday. That's a big deal for our state and for Americans anywhere. So again, you're hearing some firsthand accounts of how important this shot is, how important it is that it's only one shot, the availability of it. So let's talk about how it compares, because this is where some people get stuck in the mud. So let's talk about how it compares. Even at 66% overall efficacy, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is considered a successful vaccine. The average flu vaccine, here's where people get stuck. Most of us are not medical professionals, yet we tend to make assessments and assumptions of information that we read gingerly, be it on social media or news headlines, and make assumptions based on that without digging deeper into the details. And we're not medical professionals. So let's do our due diligence to make sure that we are fully educated before we make an assumption. And on top of that, before we begin to expound and spread and communicate these particular assumptions. For example, do you even know how effective the flu vaccine has been over the last several years? How effective is the flu vaccine? What's considered success? Most people don't know. I didn't know until I started researching it. I can't imagine just the common civilian would know this. That's not a medical professional. Why? Because we normally are not interested in a flu vaccine until we get the flu or until someone tells us the flu's going around. So anyway, I digress. The average flu vaccine usually hovers around 50%. 50% efficacy. 66% efficacy refers only to the overall results of the clinical trial. This referring to the Johnson & Johnson shot. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was 85% effective at preventing severe cases of COVID-19, and there were no deaths or hospitalizations among the group who received the vaccine. And I think they tested 40,000. Pfizer tested, I think they tested 45,000. Pfizer tested about 40,000. Moderna did about 30,000. Okay. Johnson & Johnson's test went out when these additional strains were being uncovered. South Africa, Latin America, Brazil, not so many in the U.S. So that's why their numbers are different. Pfizer Moderna's test was not necessarily on those variants, although Pfizer and Moderna are going back to do it now. Johnson & Johnson's included that data. Okay? So the important thing is that the 85% effective rate was for severe cases of COVID-19. It prevented it, and it prevented death, and it prevented the hospitalization. So let's recall what our real issue is here. The pandemic caused an influx and a burden on our healthcare networks. it was causing people not to be able to be serviced because there were more sick than there were available beds and networks and doctors to treat the sick. Therefore, the death rates were totaling and going up and up and up. Okay. Now, if it can prevent you from even going to the hospital, and certainly if it can prevent you from getting severe COVID, blood clots, pneumonia, fluid on the lungs, and these sorts of things, even at a little lower percentage rate, it is a success. This is what the doctors are saying in total. And I agree. I'm not a medical professional, but in case you were wondering, I agree. Quote, this is the challenge when we talk about efficacy. What endpoint are you using? For Johnson & Johnson, their definition was how many people are diagnosed with symptomatic, not asymptomatic, symptomatic COVID-19. Question mark. So even though the vaccine didn't prevent symptomatic cases quite as well as Moderna or Pfizer, it did a great job preventing hospitalizations and death. This according to Dr. Brandon Dion, assistant clinical professor at the School of Medicine of Pharmacy at Northeastern. So guys, at the end of the day, we have 3 total vaccines to help fight this pandemic of COVID-19. Good news. The CDC, the FDA has approved it for use, and 3.9 million doses will go out immediately. 100 million doses will hit the states with by the end of June, coupled with the other 400 to 500 million doses that are coming from Pfizer and Moderna combined. You're going to have roughly about 600 million doses of these 3 various types of vaccines out in the marketplace and the networks for people to really begin to take advantage of. And the hope, of course, is that it gets us back to a point of some level of normalcy. These numbers continue to come down. People can be safer around each other, and ultimately we stop the spread of COVID-19. So I hope you guys have found this informative. Ultimately, it's up to you. Ultimately, it's up to you. But the reason why a podcast like Things You Should Know exists is because my personal feeling is empowerment leads to better decision making. And after listening to this podcast, at least for today, you can't say, I don't have any idea about Johnson & Johnson, because you do. I just told you. If you want to do further inquiry, then do that. But make the decision after you've educated yourself in terms of what's best for you personally and what's best for your family. And of course, I wish you all well. And I'm very happy that Johnson & Johnson did get approved. And I'm happy that we're moving forward fast with affecting people positively and being able to help them, be vaccinated and free from catching COVID-19. So thank you for listening today. If you've not done so already, please make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in 2 days. Thanks.